Hello, I'm Karen Hangartner, and I'm the Project Director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which is a project of the National Children's Advocacy Center. We are excited to bring this video series about secondary traumatic stress to you. In this video series, we have conversations with three of the foremost experts in secondary traumatic stress. And in these, we discuss how do these effects show up on individuals, and how does working in the field of secondary traumatic stress impact organizations, and then how do we conduct supervision in a way that's supportive for our staff. And then we'll also hear from Chris Newland, the Executive Director of the National Children's Advocacy Center, to talk a little bit about the role that the senior leader plays in addressing secondary traumatic stress in the organization. And how do we go about creating healthy, supportive environments that support the staff that we're working with. In this video, we have a conversation with Françoise Mathieu. Françoise is the director of the TEND Academy in Ontario, Canada, and she is sought after as a speaker and a consultant to work with organizations to create more healthy work environments. In this conversation, she's going to talk about how working in high trauma exposed environments, how that impacts individuals. And then we're going to talk about some resources and some strategies that are available for you. Any of the resources that you hear mentioned that she talks about, those are going to be available to you to download. So enjoy this conversation with Françoise. Françoise, let's start with, how did you get interested in the field of secondary traumatic stress?
So I've been in the field of trauma for 23, 24 years, and I worked as a crisis worker in a college setting, and I was also working for the military as a mental health professional. And after about 7 years of working at the university, I quit. And a lot of people I knew thought I quit because I burnt out. And I actually didn't burn out. I quit because I was angry at the system all the time. I wasn't mad at my clients. I was starting to have some friction with my colleagues, but they didn't know about it. You know, that subtle, low-level frustration about all the systemic things that were making me mad. And the stories were definitely starting to get to me, and they were interfering to some degree with my personal life. But what got me interested in this whole topic is that when I left the university, and I left because I had a lot of frustration with the lack of resources and stuff, I went to do heavier trauma work with soldiers who were coming back from combat. And although their stories also got to me, I had better ways to manage and deal with those stories because my working conditions had changed. And so I became interested in this entire topic because I had never been trained in this. No one had ever talked to me about secondary trauma or burnout in my education. And I started noticing it had affected me, but it wasn't just, I heard a terrible story, it's interfered with my sleep or whatever. And the final piece is I started seeing service providers around me performing sometimes not particularly ethical care. I mean, some were amazing and some were not. And I wanted to find a solution so that we could all stay in the field of trauma, which is what has always been the love of my life, in a way where we can do good quality care, but also stay well, be good members of society, family members. You know what I mean? Like I thought there's got to be a better way to do this work. And it wasn't actually about burning out. And I didn't leave because of that. So I started kind of digging around looking for resources in that topic. And that was in around 2001.
What do you wish that someone would have told you, or how you might have been better prepared to work in a high trauma exposed environment?
Well, there are two things I wish I had received as training. First of all, this was in the 90s and things were different and we didn't know certain things. I wish I'd received trauma training which sounds weird because I did a master's degree in counseling psychology at some very good schools, excellent training on many, many things. We never talked about trauma. We didn't know about the adverse childhood experiences and how those have an impact on the people we serve. I think that would have probably transformed my career in the sense of the quality of work I delivered. I always did my best to be an ethical practitioner, but there were some, I'm not going to lie, there were some folks I worked with that were deeply, deeply challenging. And my regret is I don't think that I did the best work by them, but I think partly I just didn't have the training. I also wish we had talked about, I had probably half an hour on self-care at some point in my master's degree, take care of yourselves. But again, the books hadn't been written on the topic. So this is not a condemnation of the people who were training me. We just weren't there. So I think that would have helped understanding to recognize some of the things that early on in my profession, I noticed. I didn't know it was called secondary trauma, but I noticed things were changing for me, and I didn't have a framework for it. So I think those two things would have made the biggest difference for me.
Do you think terminology matters?
I think language is important. I think frameworks are important. I think what we call things is important as far as it helps us understand what's happening. So as you know, in the Secondary Traumatic Stress Coalition or Consortium, we developed a think tank, and we have been crafting this Venn diagram that is constantly evolving. But the Venn diagram was really an attempt for all of us to have a framework to see how we can't just have a one solid definition and say, this is secondary traumatic stress. And if you have these things, and if you're high functioning, that's fine. But if you're at the end of it, you have PTSD, that kind of continuum. We started realizing that as service providers, it's a lot more complex than that. And there are personal factors that are going on. What's going on in your workplace? What's going on in your society? How much indirect trauma have you got? How much direct exposure do you have? What is the level of your empathic strain? What about moral distress and systems failures? So I believe in terminology as long as it allows flexibility. I think the problem sometimes with the lack of clarity with the terminology is that it's created a little bit of silos. So physicians use the word burnout exclusively to represent everything we're talking about today. Other people use the word secondary trauma to represent everything we're talking about today. Other people use other words. And so I think we need clarity so we can do better research. But as individual practitioners, I think what's really important is more the idea of the Venn diagram, to be able to identify what are the real factors that are affecting my functioning and the quality of care that I provide.
Which concepts on the Venn diagram do you think are most important for people to be aware of?
So I think that one of them are personal vulnerability factors. I think that's highly important. What are you bringing to the table in terms of your own lived experience? We know that many service providers have their own lived experience, which is absolutely completely fine and normal, providing that you've done your work and that you're aware of your triggers. What else is going on in your life? I was just doing a training last week where someone was in a caregiver role where she had to leave session to go and call her nursing home to deal with her mother's, we're all humans, wasn't it Yogi Berra who said, we're all bozos on the bus? So we're all bozos on the bus. And that's one really important factor. What are you personally bringing to your ability to function and focus in your work? Another piece of the Venn diagram, of course, is anything related to secondary trauma exposure. Some of the folks that are watching this are in very high trauma exposed environments. Maybe they're dealing with, child sexual exploitation, internet trafficking. We're not suggesting that they're going to be less affected. Of course, you're going to be affected because of the volume and the nature of what you see. And so that's a really important factor to look at, which we often call indirect trauma. The other piece to me that's really important is the moral distress around systemic barriers. And the other one are working conditions. And I think all of those can create a situation where you are doing really well, or it allows you to identify what are the problem areas. So if I can go back to my own experience of leaving my job, it wasn't the trauma exposure per se. I mean, that was significant, but I had tools to manage that. It was really the climate and the context in which I was working that was becoming unacceptable. So having that framework in hindsight is really helpful to try and understand not only what was happening, but what are the tools and strategies I can use.
What were some of the tools and strategies that you had in place at that time?
Very little. We had to kind of invent it. Do you know what I mean? Like, so what happened is in 2001, I was working as a crisis counselor and with the military, and of course, volunteering on 3 boards and, like volunteering at the prison. I think like many service providers are doing, raising a family. And I came across this document called Guidebook on Vicarious Trauma for Domestic Violence Workers. And a colleague of mine, very good friend, and I read it, and we were like, this is us. And we had never heard about it. And so we created a very informal, small community of practice, the 2 of us. So we started talking about self-care strategies, how to transition from home to work, or from work to home, rather. We started making decisions about workplace toxicity because we were working in the same environment. And we made concrete decisions not to leave every staff meeting and lock ourselves in the broom closet to complain about everything we were frustrated with, because it started to not be productive. And I started doing a trauma audit of my extraneous trauma exposure in my personal life. So I stopped reading or watching the news. I stopped watching CSI or Law and Order at night. So I was kind of improvising, I'll be honest. I had this one book with a checklist, and the rest I kind of followed my gut. And then I realized what I really needed was more training to be skilled at working with the people I was working with. So way more trauma training, way more. Yeah.
What were some of the differences in the working conditions of those 2 places?
So my second job with the military, I was a free agent. So I was self-employed. I was a service provider for their employee assistance program. So I had my own private practice. So that meant I had complete control over my schedule. So I didn't see my 3 most challenging people Friday afternoon on a full moon, right? I might see them, intersperse them. I could interrupt my day to go to the gym or to go look after a family situation. So I had flexibility. So that was huge. I had less job security, but let's be honest, there were a lot of soldiers coming back. I mean, the need was there. I created my own supervision because at my previous job, we lost access to regular supervision. So I had regular supervision that I created for myself with people in the community, flexibility. I had referral resources. So it wasn't perfect, but with the VA and with our insurance companies, I actually had somewhere to send these folks. And that was highly protective for me because I felt like I was doing ethical works because I could actually help them, but also refer them to something. So those were huge differences for me, even though it was higher trauma work, if that makes sense.
Talk to us a little bit about moral distress.
So moral distress is a term that comes from the field of medical ethics. And as we know, every hospital has a medical ethicist on call when there are some very big decisions that have ethical ramifications. And moral distress is defined as when, policies, rules, regulations, what have you, conflict with what you believe is ethical and right. And we could have a lot of examples of that in a hospital environment, early discharge of a patient to nothing. Ineligibility, like they don't have the right insurance, and so they can't get this treatment. In my work, and I've heard this from probably 100,000 different service providers that I've met over the years, it's when what you believe is the ethical thing to do is not allowed or permitted or possible, either because it's the rule of your agency, so this person's not eligible for a service, either because the service that you think they deserve doesn't exist anymore. Maybe there's been a cut, or maybe they just filled out the wrong form and all of a sudden what they should get isn't available. And what I'm seeing is moral distress is a huge contributing factor to people burning out, because at some point you feel like, am I causing harm? Even though, or, my hands are tied. And I remember a very specific case, which I'm happy to share with you if you want, that to me was probably the trigger to make me decide to leave that job. And it's, probably a story that a lot of people have heard from or experienced in a variety of ways. But so I was working in a very high pressure environment. We were seeing a lot of people. We had a lot of cuts at the same time. And I saw a young man who I helped with a very difficult decision to make. And he was going to go to his family and kind of disclose something to them. And he came back at the end of the weekend and it had gone terribly. Every worst case scenario I could have imagined it happened. And his family basically said, never darken our doorsteps again. And as we know, when those situations happen, the risk of self-harm or suicide are high. It was a time where this young man needed more support than ever before. And my boss came to me and he said, I'm so sorry, you have reached your session limit. Right? And that was a moment where I was like, you know what? I'm not okay with this. This is wrong. And I understand the bigger systemic issue, but in that moment as a human being, that didn't sit okay with me. So if you think about, I'm sure some of us have had 100, 500, 1,000 decisions like that. We can't just quit every time something like that happens. I think that it was an accumulation for me where after 7 years of that, I thought, you know what? I got to do something else.
Tell us a little bit more about the secondary traumatic stress continuum.
So, I think the continuum is a really good framework to understand that it is normal to be impacted by difficult stories that we see and hear. In fact, we kind of want to be affected to some degree, because otherwise that would be concerning. Now, what's also interesting, however, as a sidebar, is that when you've been in the field for a very long time, there are certain stories that won't affect you anymore because you've seen and heard so many. So, of course, there's a certain level of desensitization that takes place. And I'm sure any of you, if you remember from when you were a rookie, if you've had a lot of experience now, absolutely there are things that used to impact you that now you're like, yeah, I've seen hundreds of those. So I think a certain level of desensitization is completely par for the course. But when we're talking about the continuum, we're kind of going to being really high functioning and not being negatively impacted or impaired to, the end of the continuum where we are really impacted and impaired. And maybe we may actually have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. We may need to go on leave or receive some assistance. So there really is a progression, if you will, along the way. And one of the things that we're interested in is looking at what are the points where we can get people to, first of all, identify what's happening, workplaces to be aware of that. Do these symptoms, if you will, do they persevere? What we want to be able to provide service providers with and the people in their units and their teams that they work with is an ability to, first of all, recognize what are these warning signs? How do I know that I've been particularly affected by either a story or maybe it's a whole volume of stories that are really similar. Maybe it's that kind of gradual erosion because you've heard so many things that are similar, or maybe there's an outlier of something that is so truly distressing and disturbing that it's really hitched a ride with you. The other factor sometimes, and I'm going to bring the personal stuff back in, is we all have personal vulnerability and resiliency factors. So I've heard from many people in the field that having their own children or their grandchildren sometimes became a vulnerability factor because they could sort of relate or identify with a particular case because maybe that child is the same age as your child or your grandchild. So it's really about being able to identify along the way, is this really causing significant functional impairment? But what we don't want to do is get to people when they're in the red zone. We want to be able to get there where, the green zone is when you're doing really well and maybe there are a couple of things that are bothering you. But as you start shifting more to the yellow zone, we want to be able to identify that early so that we can put things in place personally and reach out professionally, and even our agency can kind of be able to identify that. So that's where the strategies come in along the way. And some of them, I do believe, are self-care and wellness strategies. I don't think that we can do this work running and living on adrenaline, caffeine, sugar, and 4 hours of sleep. We're not robots. And I think that self-care practices absolutely have a place to be able to refuel and reset. And I think there are a lot of practices in the workplace that can also allow us to ground ourselves moment to moment. I had a colleague who recently said to me, self-care and grounding skills in this work doesn't mean that you go through the whole day at breakneck speed and then collapse on your yoga mat at 5 o'clock. Like, that's not self-care.
How do professionals figure out what their triggers are?
I like to call it the big 3 warning signs. Of course, we may have a whole host of them, but what we found is that some of these, identifying these warning signs, are actually really robust, and they tend to really withstand the test of time and life and changes. And so kind of looking at, we break them down into kind of behavioral warning signs and physical warning signs, and then more psychological or emotional warning signs. And so I really like to start at the basic. And what I believe is, in order to understand the professional, you need to understand the personal. You need to understand yourself. And so when I do some training, I'll get people to identify what are their physical warning signs. You and I were joking earlier that, often I get a raspy voice, or I lose my voice, or, there's certain things that are, that's been for 23 years since I've been in the field. Someone else gets migraines or neck and shoulder pain or irritable bowel or whatever. So number 1, what are your physical warning signs, and how do you know you're headed for trouble? Number 2, what are some of the behaviors that you've noticed? For example, to go back to my story of when I was working in this environment, my number 1 behavioral warning sign was that I had low tolerance for office chit-chat. I was still fine with my clients, but all the stuff that people do, like they had lunch together and they talk about books. Is that all? I had no tolerance for that. And I started taking the fire escape to avoid my receptionist to get to my office, because she was so cheerful, and she'd be like, "Good morning," and although I think that's it sounds funny and light, it really was a warning sign for me, because what was happening is that I was kind of shrinking into hyper efficient trauma mode. Like, I was just going to manage and handle my clients, and there was no room left for the gravy and the fun stuff, right? And that's very individual, but I personally have found that when I'm highly trauma exposed, I hunker down and I kind of diminish things to the smallest units of trying to be really efficient, and I lose my sense of humor. I lose my sense of play. Transition home. So I might get home and someone at home might have wanted to talk about something that had nothing to do with trauma, and I'd be drumming my fingers thinking to myself, let's get this done. Like, so I think that I really believe that all of us need to look at the big 3. What are your physical, behavioral, and emotional warning signs before we can move to anything else? Because really, self-awareness is such a key element. And then in the workplace, I encourage people to have safe and honest conversations about, what do you look like when you're in the yellow zone? So I was working with an agency last week where it was a brand new group of people. So some people have been there for 4 days. Can you believe? Like, they'd hired a whole bunch of new people, and they needed to have conversations about, one person said, "Look, I'm an introvert, and when I'm heavily exposed to trauma, I need quiet. I need solitude. So if my office door is closed, it's not a get out of my face. It's actually self-care." But if you didn't know that, can you imagine? It's like a brand new person, her door is closed, and you're thinking, well, what's wrong with her? So I also think it can lead to misunderstandings and conflicts that are completely avoidable and can then help not having a toxic work environment.
How does an employee lead up in order to facilitate change in their organization?
So it's a great question, because you're right. Not every workplace is engaged, aware, or even interested in this. And we all have to make individual decisions about how we conduct ourselves personally and professionally, even if we don't have control over the larger organization. So I'll give you an example. I have worked several times with agencies in the correctional system. And as many of us know, those can be extremely high trauma and pretty toxic work environments. And yet, I found some people along the way who were actually well, service providers who were well. And I really wanted to know about that. How do you stay well when you are in an environment that is really where you have no control and it can be pretty toxic? And there's some really, really, really interesting research on that as well, about what are individual decisions and practices we make. And you remember Stephen Covey's circles of influence and control? And I really like that kind of idea where there's certain things that are absolutely within your control. And not to sound facetious, but what is within my control is maybe whether I bring a healthy lunch. But it's also whether I engage in office gossip with my colleague or whether I make a positive strategic alliance, not to bully other people, but to not also engage in some of the stuff that really leads us to having a negative interaction with one another. So I think what's also in the circle of control is who I choose to be with, who I choose to be at work. And a dear colleague of mine said to me one day, she said she was working in a really tricky place. And she said, I have a choice every day on my way to work to be a negative, a positive, or a neutral influence. And she said, sometimes I choose neutral because positive is not possible for whatever reason. She goes, but I have a choice in that. And so that second circle of what you influence is really huge. And I like to focus on those two, who you spend time with and how do you choose to discuss and talk about the people you serve, the people you work with. I think that's within everyone's purview.
What can individuals do to be more resilient?
Well, it's an exciting time to be in the field because we're having more and more research, for example, looking at neuroscience and looking at ways to reduce our own reactions, looking at ways that in the moment we can ground ourselves literally before, during, and after we're being exposed to difficult stories. And that's not research that we had 10, 15 years ago. Those aren't tools that were available. When I read about it at first, what we were all told, and I'm sure you were too, 15, 20 years ago, is we were all supposed to do yoga and breathe more, and that was going to fix everything. And don't get me wrong, I believe in those things. And I really do believe that practices such as yoga are essential ways to widen our window of tolerance and be able to deal with life as it comes. So I absolutely believe in that. But I really like to break it down into individual strategies and then personal strategies, professional strategies, things we can do as a team, things that agencies can do. I mean, there are many, many different layers and levels of what can make a difference. So personally, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I really think that getting more training so that you are skilled and competent in helping folks and feeling like you're not an imposter, the imposter syndrome. I'm sure we've all had it at the beginning of our career where someone came in front of us and we totally faked it, but inside we're like, you should really see someone about that, and you realize, oh, that's me, and the same is true for people put in, thrust into supervisory roles where they haven't had time to learn and train, and we need time. So number one is training. The problem is that when there are cutbacks, the very first thing that goes by the wayside is backfill and funding for people to receive training. So I think that's a fatal mistake. The more equipped we are, the more context we have. If I had the knowledge 20 years ago that I have now about the adverse childhood experiences, about complex developmental trauma, if I knew that, I think I would have been more effective at my work, and then I would have been less depleted because I was more effective. There's certain things though, trauma exposure and seeing and hearing terrible stories of children being harmed, I don't think will ever get easy. But I think that there's some interesting research that needs to be done to look at how much is too much. Are there certain type of ways where we could vary caseloads? Is there a certain way to look at evidence, forensic evidence that could be less harmful? We're beginning to look at that. And I think those are really interesting routes to look at as well. And I also think, when I do a lot of workshops where sometimes I think an agency is horrified by what I'm about to say because they've hired me to come in, and I say, I really am a big believer in quitting. I think there are times, first of all, I don't think everyone's cut out to do this work. I think that when we look at trainees and, new recruits, I think that some people go into this field to process their own unresolved traumas. And you understand the distinction. I think a lot of us have lived experience, but I see people who are still struggling. And I also think that certain things are really hard to teach. I think it's really hard to teach empathy. I mean, you can teach people skills, but if you don't have it at the beginning, I think there's certain things where some people are just really cut out for this and some others are not. I also think that some of us, it's better to do a different type of work in the trauma field than certain other things. I can give you an example. I have a dear friend of mine who can never work in the animal care community. She can't deal with animals being harmed. That's just soul crushing for her. But she can work in child welfare. So I think there are a lot of individual factors that make us good at that or not.
How do you make self-care a priority?
I get that question all the time about guilt. And I hear it from a variety of places. I hear it from people saying, I'm a person of privilege. It feels like, how dare I take this time for myself when the people I serve have so little, so kind of that piece. And in her book, Trauma Stewardship, Laura Van Den Lipsky has a wonderful story about that of, I believe it was a director of a women's shelter who just comes back to the shelter after, quite frankly, a wonderful weekend. She'd had a wonderful weekend. And she gets back and one of the residents in the shelter says, oh, how was your weekend? And she was like, oh, it was fine. And she said, basically, she felt somehow guilty that if she'd said, oh, I'd had a wonderful weekend, it was somehow an insult or disrespectful to this woman who was suffering. And Laura talks about, how do we somehow internalize this, that we have to dampen down and not be allowed to celebrate the fact that maybe we had a lovely weekend or things happen. The same is true conversely, by the way, too, right? So we have to show our professional selves. And maybe we've actually had a terrible weekend, and maybe we had a fight with our partner, or maybe we're going through a divorce, and that's the other part that we also have to suppress. So the piece about guilt and self-care I find really interesting, because I started seeing clinicians in particular who were working what I consider to be, quite frankly, unethical levels of caseloads. I had some serious concerns about their ability to be present. So I actually flip it around, and I think that self-care is an ethical duty. We think nothing of people who do, I give this example often, but my brother works for Cirque du Soleil, and we think it's completely normal that these Olympic level acrobats take exquisitely good care of their bodies so that they don't have an injury or fall or hurt themselves. Everyone agrees with that. But when I come in our fields, people will say to me, I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. Check me out. I think that's unethical, respectfully. So I think of it in a different way. I take good care of myself. So personally, a big one for me is sleep. It's not for everybody, but I get a lot of sleep. I try and get some exercise and not fill myself with stimulants all day so that I can be present, so that when you need me, I'm on, I'm not distracted, I'm fully there for you. So that's how I think of it. I think it's my professional duty to take care of myself.
How do you balance the expectations of yourself, donors, and other professionals with knowing what your own boundaries are?
I think that talk to anyone in this field who's been around for more than 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. And I think everyone, if they're being honest, will say that they've, burnt out or close to it several times in their career. I think I always say, I'm a deeply flawed individual, and I only realized that in my 40s, and it was the most liberating thing in the world. Because in my 20s and 30s, I had to prove probably to myself and to the world that I had it all figured out. And it was such a relief to realize that I make mistakes, I overcommit, I overextend myself, and sometimes that ends up not going well. So if you don't mind, I can give a personal example. This summer, I had yet again done that. And I had a trusted advisor who's a really good friend of mine. And I wrote about this in a blog, and then she went back and she was like, am I the trusted advisor? It was very cute. And I called the blog post Disappoint Someone Today. And I started realizing that one of the things that I think a lot of us who are attracted to this field, and you called it a calling, truly, that for us it's a calling. I think that we were helpers long before we went into this field. I think that we were the go-to for people in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our school. I certainly know that's true for me and for many people I've talked to. And I know that I received powerful messages about responsibility, about somehow that, we had a responsibility to contribute to our society. And I don't regret receiving those messages, but the flip side is that there are times where, to bring back the subject of guilt, that there are times where you can have tremendous guilt when you don't do your A++ 100%. And, Kristen Neff talks about self-compassion. I think that that's where the inner critic becomes really active about, I could do more. I should have done more. Or heaven forbid, maybe we actually do get disciplined or reprimanded at work, which can be devastating, right? And so I think this is a life's work, that if we are truly called to do this work, we do have to have an ongoing reflection process about what's happening, how am I doing, where am I at, why does this feel too much? And maybe it is too much, but what do I do if my agency tells me I'm supposed to see twice as many people as what feels right? And this is also where it's funny, we stopped talking somehow in the last decade about accessing personal counseling for ourselves. That used to be a thing that was almost a requirement, that we have access to our own clinical supervision, our own personal counseling as needed. And I think we need to bring that back in. I certainly have gained tremendous insights and value from going to see people I trust, whether they are in a professional capacity or personal, when I need to process and reflect. And I feel like we lost that somehow along the way,
How do we begin to set those boundaries so that we're not overextending ourselves?
I'm reading a great book right now by Tony Crabb. It's called Busy. And I believe he's an organizational psychologist. And he talks about we have a limited bandwidth. And we have limited capacity. That is just a fact. And I was reflecting on that a couple of months ago. I was on a trip with my spouse, and my spouse has twice as much energy and needs half as much sleep as me. So it's a very interesting journey, because as we were going through the day, I was like, I can only do this much. So that's just a capacity and bandwidth thing. So here's the thing. This summer, when I decided to set some limits because I was maxed out, what I had to do is disappoint a bunch of people. And the thing about setting limits is that it doesn't always go well. We have, and I'm not blaming ourselves, but we have trained people in our worlds to expect a lot, and we deliver, right? We work to deadlines, we work beyond. And when we start setting limits, the thing that's not really fun about saying no is the response, if it's not a compassionate one. And so I found that to be a really interesting exercise. Is I went out and disappointed a whole bunch of people. I said no, I set limits, and they were not happy. They were disappointed. And to me, I don't know if it's true for other people, but disappointing someone is worse, almost worse than anything. And I remember this story where my daughter was driving home from somewhere. So she called me on speakerphone, and the car's full of all her friends, public. And she says, Mom, you left an appliance on. I think I left an iron on at home. And she said, I'm not angry, but I'm disappointed. Right? And I thought it was so, where do you think she learned that? And so I really think that the problem sometimes is that we have given people the illusion that we have endless energy and stamina. And by the way, it may be true when you're younger. I look around and I have a team that are younger than me, and they actually do. They have more stamina. But you know what I have? I have, and I'm not trying to say like I'm wiser than them, but I have experience and I have competence and I do have wisdom. And there are certain things where I do think I work smarter than I did before. I've learned a lot, but it's not sustainable. And yet when we set limits, sometimes there are consequences that I think it would be a lie to say, go and, say no, do what you want. There was a book that said, do what you love, the money will follow. Well, I don't know if that's true. Go make earrings, you'll be rich. Well, maybe not. You might be happy, but you might be poor. So
can you give some examples of how this work impacts us in positive ways?
oh my goodness, what a good conversation. I have on my screensaver this picture of a little boy. I got it off Instagram, I think. And he's about 4 or 5 years old and he's holding this cabbage that he's just harvested. And he is laughing like, head thrown back, like and looking at that photo fills me with joy every single time I look at it. And I think that, there was some work done on vicarious resilience. Some members of our think tank have been looking at that. What are the things that make you think in your day-to-day interaction with the people you serve, what a privilege it is? I am in awe of your courage. I am in awe of your resourcefulness. And having talked to many, many people in the field, I don't think those moments have to happen even daily or weekly. I think we cherish them because if we have had the honor, the privilege of being a tiny part of that person's journey towards that, I don't know about you, but that makes it all worth it for me.
Is secondary traumatic stress caused by caring too much?
Originally, 20 to 25 years ago, when researchers were trying to put a name to something that they were seeing happen. And it was a real thing. And it didn't have a label or a name or a diagnosis or strategies or anything else. And we need to remember that what they were observing were service providers who were working in high trauma situations, who were being very negatively affected by this indirect exposure. That's really the beginning of this process. So by then, we had the diagnosis of PTSD for people who'd been in combat and people who'd been in, those types of situations. But we didn't have a word or a framework to understand what is happening to us when we're indirectly being affected by this. So we need to remember that was where it started. And there were a lot of different words that were being used to try and tease out the difference between, is it a shift in your worldview and your kind of construct of the world? Is it an erosion of your ability to care? And I think that that process and that exploration was really important and valuable. And I think we're somewhere a little further along in terms of that exploration. And the word, for example, compassion fatigue was used for a really long time, either interchangeably with secondary trauma. In fact, it was created as a more user-friendly term, kind of less pathologizing term. But then it kind of took a life of its own, and some people started saying, is it the cost of caring too much? Like that somehow we cared too much for the people we served, and that's why we became negatively affected. And then some other folks in the field started saying, wait a minute, you can't run out of compassion. It's kind of like love. I have 2 biological children and 17 other kids that I take care of in a variety of ways. And it's not like one more gets added and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, Trevor, I'm all out of love. Like it doesn't work like that, right? It's an endlessly replenishing resource. And I believe that so is compassion. But the idea that there can be a strain, and some people have been using the term more empathic strain right now. Is there a possibility where being in that hopefully deeply connected professional relationship where you are there to assist someone who has experienced very difficult things, is it possible that gets strained either because you're exposed to an incredibly large volume of them? And I know so many people have said to me, I've seen thousands of stories that I could almost fill out the paperwork before they start. I know where it's going. I know what's happened. And I just don't have the same level of engagement that I had at the beginning. I think that's probably realistic. Or maybe it's a case where the person sabotages every single thing you've tried to do. I was working in a women's shelter last week, and they were saying, I found housing, I found a job, she didn't show, and it's the 7th time, and I'm done. And I think that experience, I don't think that's secondary trauma. I think it's something else on the Venn diagram that we're currently calling empathic strain. I think that really is an emotional and physical exhaustion, a depletion that can happen in our personal lives too. I often give the example, if you've ever had a friend who went through the world's longest ever breakup and they went back and back again. I think that at some point in our bandwidth and in our capacity, there is an erosion. And so I think that that's the way to think about that piece, about kind of this wear and tear. And so I think that the notion of strain is a more accurate one. So the notion, from Richard Harrison, the beautiful term that he used called exquisite empathy. And this was a study, it was a small study, but they looked at award-winning, peer-nominated counselors in their community. These were really the people considered the best in the West, so to speak. And they had all been in practice for a long time. And through interviews, he identified, I think there were 17 different factors that every single one of these clinicians practiced, these 17 things. A little less exciting than exquisite empathy, which I'll go back to, but they all had an external practice of some kind. They all had a life outside of work. But exquisite empathy was really this notion of this moment-by-moment ability to retain equanimity, so the ability to remain present in the face of what's coming at you, not waiting till the end of the day to process all the stuff that you've been exposed to. So it really was a moment-by-moment presence. And I think that those are tools that we need to explore more, as opposed to the idea of, arming ourselves to go in and then at the end of the day, decontaminating ourselves. I think that I like those ideas better.
How do we integrate some of these healthy practices into our everyday lives?
I was working with an agency last week where the director is wonderful. And as we know, leadership matters so much. And she said to her staff, you're seeing too many folks. You're not taking breaks in between. You're cramming. And she said, that's not how we work here. This is a workplace where people were brand new. And she was saying, this is not how, and this is a sexual assault center. She said, this is not how we work here. That's not sustainable. I need you to pace yourself so that you can stick around and do a good job. But that's really tough because, first of all, personally, I don't know about you, but a lot of us, we multitask, we get a lot of stuff done. We may feel that that's, not a good use of our time. I recently had to do some physiotherapy, and it's something I'm supposed to do every day. It takes 30 seconds. And for a month, I didn't do it. 30 seconds. So what I did is I built my habit in now that when my coffee is brewing in the morning, I do my physio. Right. So what we found also, there's some really interesting research on whether people adhere to healthy habits. And what's been found is that if you combine it with something pleasant or you have an immediate reward, you're much more likely to do the things that are a little less pleasant or feel like more like a chore. And by a reward, I don't mean a chocolate. Like it could be something, a small thing. So for me, for example, I do the physio and then I get the coffee. Does that make sense? So I think that some of those can be absolutely built into our day-to-day work environment because they don't take long. But once they become a practice, they become also embedded in our, it becomes metabolized. We learn, and our brain and our body learn to reset as we go through the day.
What are 3 strategies that you recommend for professionals to incorporate into their everyday life?
All right, so the first one is drink some water. Not caffeinated drinks, not sugary drinks, drink some water. Flush out those stress hormones. Number 2, my colleague, Pat Fisher, has developed something she calls the hot walk and talk. So when there's a lot going on and you're feeling really activated and you need to process, find a colleague you trust. Don't slime them necessarily with the details. You don't need to debrief with the graphic nature, but walk it out with them. Go and walk, drink some water, talk about it. Those things can take minutes, being able to process that. I have a colleague who works in a prison, and what she does when she's been exposed to something very upsetting is she does the stairs or 10 jumping jacks. This is not a workout. This is about flushing out those stress hormones. So I guess that would all fall into like one category, drink some water, hot walk and talk, metabolize what's going on. So that's the first one. There's some really good strategies out there now. If you look at some of the websites like calm.com or Headspace, there's one that's called a 3-minute breathing space. Those things don't take long, 3 minutes. There's some really good grounding techniques like the Hakomi 5-4-3-2-1. That's very easy. You can find it online. And again, these are resetting activities that you can do in the moment. You could even do them in court, like nobody knows. And the third one is I really think you need to have a transition ritual between sessions or as you leave the day so that you can leave that behind.
Explain your low-impact debriefing model.
All right, so this model came out of this one-liner that we read in Lorianne Perlman and Karen Sick-Whitney's book years ago, and they talked about limited disclosure. And they were talking about strategies so that we can protect one another. And my colleague Robin Cameron and I looked at that, and this is going to age us a little bit, but you remember high impact aerobics? Some of you will remember that, right? And then we all got shin splints because we were bouncing. Anyway, so Robin and I started thinking about, wait a minute, is there a way to think about this that would be a low impact aerobics, a low impact way to debrief one another as we need without re-traumatizing or contaminating people with the graphic nature of what came up? So that's kind of the history of it. And so we call it, the acronym is LID, but not like keep a lid on it like fully, more like a little pressure cooker. So let the steam out gradually. So there are 4 steps to low impact debriefing, and it's very simple. And once people know them, you can use it anywhere. And the steps are the following. So the first one is, I'll go through them and I'll explain what they are. So the first one is self-awareness. The second one, I kind of switch them around all the time, but the second one is fair warning. The third one is consent. And the fourth one is actually limited disclosure. And so the first piece I invite everyone to think about is, when is it the appropriate time to share graphic details of something? I have been to many child abuse conferences. I go to them all the time. And I have found that there are times where the keynote speakers, the trainers now we use the term sliming. It's very informal, but I think people get the image where people it is not a debriefing situation. It's not even a case consultation. It's a training. They will share very, very graphic images and stories to the world without, and just saying to people, this is going to be upsetting, I'm going to push play. That doesn't cut it with me. So I started becoming concerned about the informal way in which we're all flinging trauma at one another, partly because I think a lot of us are quite desensitized. And so we could eat a sandwich and be like, oh, that's nothing. Wait till you hear what I saw. And I see this a lot in first responders, for example, and child abuse investigators, for example. And I wanted to explore a way where we could do that in a way that, first of all, is consent-based, but also controlled. So low impact debriefing would look like this. First of all, it's not a water cooler chat. It's not, at the soccer game sitting it is something where I know that I have seen or heard something distressing that I need to process. And I think many of us, it's quite an immediate need. It's not like I'm going to wait till tomorrow. It's kind of like now, which I totally understand. And so if I worked with you, the first step is I would have the self-awareness to know that what I actually need right now is a debriefing, not a water cooler chat. Number 2, I would give you fair warning that that's what I'm about to do. Because I don't know if you've ever had someone deliver bad news to you and you didn't know that was coming. It's like a punch in the gut. Whereas if I said to you, you better sit down, I have some bad news, it allows us to prepare ourselves. So I would say to you, Karen, I need a debrief, so you know what that means. Secondly, I'd say it's about fill in the blank so that you can know. And then I would say, do I have your permission? And you might say, listen, I'm in the red zone today. Go tell so and so instead. And I would respect that because we work together. It might also be that it's about something that's actually quite close to home right now. So, something happened recently in my family. Everyone's fine, but something very upsetting happened. And if you wanted to debrief something similar, I'd probably say, can you pass? Like just for now. Or you might actually say, bring it. I'm all yours. But that's a very different setup. The final piece of low impact debriefing is, do you say the cliff notes in America? The Coles notes, the cliff notes, So tell me the cliff notes. And so I like to draw, when I do this, I draw an outer circle. And then in the middle, I call it the full Monty. Like that's what you'd hear in court and the pictures, like the whole thing. Don't start there. Start with the cliff notes. And gradually, I may tell you more. I may need to tell you more. You might not need to hear more. But that transaction, even if I end up telling you the whole thing and showing you all the pictures and stuff, I think that's really, really different experientially for you as the recipient than me just blurting it out. Have you got a minute? And I think that allows you to ground yourself and process. And, it may not be upsetting to you. Maybe you've heard thousands of stories like that. But it's just, it's almost etiquette. It's just an extra little step that we could take. What's the harm in not oversharing? And I do think it prevents a certain amount of contagion. And I think it's good practice.